Welcome to the Think Forward podcast, where we speak with futurists, innovators, and big thinkers. Come along with your host, Steve Fisher, and explore the future together.
Welcome, friends and fellow futurists and big thinkers, to another exciting episode of Think Forward, where we explore the ever-expanding horizons of the future. In this episode, we're diving headfirst into the world of non-obvious thinking. Now, if you're wondering what non-obvious means, well, you're in the right place. Today's guest has spent years turning this concept into a powerhouse of trend spotting, creativity, and unexpected insights, helping us all see what most people overlook. He's a best-selling author, trend curator, and keynote speaker who's mastered the art of taking the road less traveled, because he knows that's where all the interesting stuff happens. In today's episode, we'll explore how to train ourselves to notice those things we might typically pass by. And trust me, our guest has stories to prove it. From his famous wall of Post-it notes, enough to make anyone's head spin, to his method for connecting the most unlikely ideas, he's cracked the code on spotting hidden gems in everyday life. We'll dive into the art of finding option C in a world that constantly tells us to pick between option A and B, learning to tap into the unexpected, taking our ideas into new directions and open our minds to the possibilities all around us, even in the most surprising places, like the food smelling machine or the banana slicer you didn't know you needed. Get ready for a conversation packed with laughs, serious aha moments, and practical advice you can use in business, creativity, or simply viewing the world with fresh eyes. So sit back, relax, and prepare to think differently as we embrace the non-obvious with one of the sharpest, most original minds around. Welcome to episode 120, Non-Obvious Thinking with Rohit Bhargava. Rohit, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's good to talk with you.
I've been reading your stuff for years. I've known you for a long time. I don't know how many have read the non-obvious books, and there's so much more than that about you. Let's start with your story.
Yeah. What should I tell you? It's funny. We've probably known each other for, I don't know, like 15 years or something, like relatively long time, longer than some people who's listening have had a career for, probably.
That's a really interesting way of framing it.
Yeah. But it's one of those things you realize over time that you've known someone for a long time, and we've had conversations probably over a beer or something at some point. But to spend time together like this, I don't know, we've really done that. So this is a fun chance for me too.
Yeah, you travel a lot. You're a very in demand and popular person, which is a good thing to be in the speaking and author world these days. I got to meet you when you were first starting out with Non-Obvious. The one thing I remember very vividly is your room with all the Post-it notes, all the articles, all the captured information. Like, I am ADHD, so for me, it would overwhelm the system. How did you get into this idea of the non-obvious way of thinking? How did that kind of come about?
I suppose I've always been a writer. I did an English major. I was writing plays, and I was really interested in the creative side of that writing.
Yeah.
And I think non-obvious for me came about because I was doing what many writers do at some point, which is you've got a commitment to write something and you've got to come up with something interesting to say. And so I started this method that you mentioned where I'm constantly looking for ideas, saving ideas. And I created my own method for doing that. And one of the secrets that I uncovered in the process of doing that is that sometimes the best ideas come from operating on a time scale that others don't. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, especially with blogging, you've done this, I've done this. Yeah. You're looking for what's the story this week that I can respond to, right? And what hardly anyone does is what's the interesting story 9 months ago that I saved and now I'm coming back to and relating to something that's happening today, or maybe even not, relating it to something that happened 3 months ago. So now you're taking a 9-month-old story along with a 3-month-old story and projecting forward, like, what does this mean for the future? And to me, like, that gave me unique insights that no one else had because I was just operating with different information. And that kind of became my signature thing. And when people ask me, what sort of ideas do I look for? What do I look for to write about? I started describing them as non-obvious. In fact, you'll find this interesting. So when I did my first book, which was in 2008, this was really probably 3 years before I even started talking about non-obvious, and definitely before non-obvious became like a brand and I trademarked it and all of that stuff like came later, right? But in 2008, I wrote this book called Personality Not Included. And the foreword, the introduction to that book says the non-obvious way to read this book. So I was using that as lingo before I even turned it into a brand and before I even realized what it could become, right? Because I was just using it as a way to describe the sort of ideas I wanted to write about.
I think that's where I met you. I have to shout out Shashi Belamkonda on the podcast here.
Yeah.
Mutual friend. I think that I met you through that because you were heavily, I would say you were a marketer, branding. Like that was your...
Yeah, I was at Ogilvy at that time.
You were at Ogilvy.
Yeah.
When you were at Ogilvy, would you consider the non-obvious way of thinking as a trend spotting or curation method for people? Because a lot of trend spotters...
Yeah, that's how it's started.
It's a bit mystical as to how people like search for trends. It's a bit non-obvious in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because that is definitely where it started. That was where the heritage of non-obvious thinking was. And for literally a decade, as I was writing these books about trends, a new one every year, I talked about non-obvious trend curation, exactly what you said. And it was like the non-obvious way of thinking could help you to see the future, anticipate what's coming next, and identify trends. And it was only in 2020, right around when the pandemic hit, and I'd released 2 months before the pandemic, I released the last edition of the Non-Obvious Trend Report, which was a 10-year project, a new book every year. Non-Obvious Megatrends came out in January of 2020. And at that point, a lot of things changed, obviously. But for me, non-obvious was no longer just about trends. And now I was faced with this challenge that I think some of us are faced with it at a certain point where we've been talking about something for a while. We've established some ownership over it. We're maybe known for that thing. And now we're faced with this question of what do we do next? Do I just do 2.0 of that thing?
Right.
Do I pivot and do something entirely different, which I did do? Or do I come back to it, which is now what I'm coming back to? And so now the new book, Non-Obvious Thinking, takes this method and says, well, it's not just about trends. If you can be a non-obvious thinker, you can be more open-minded and see these opportunities and really change your life. And it's more of a mindset. So what it's evolved to now, 15 years later, is a mindset. And the brand is around that. Where before, what it started with was trends.
Yeah, for a while there, it felt like you were making what is your parachute every year, like doing every year.
That's do that at a certain point, right? Especially when we leave. Like when I left Ogilvy, that was a big moment for me. When I'm like, okay, am I going to do my own thing? Am I going to go find another agency job? Am I going to go client side, the dark side, right? Could I do that? So we're faced with these moments, I think, in our careers, and we have to try and do the best we can.
That's great. I think there's many people out there considering, especially with the advent of generative AI, what it means for their careers. I'm one of them, right? I've spent 30 years in technology, many pivots, many in navigation through changes and new technologies. And this is a big shift, big super shift. I think getting out there, people have to consider what they're going to do. And I like the mindset itself. When people think about changing the world, there's a lot of short-sightedness. And it's if people to get into that framework. If you were to distill it into one sentence, what is the mindset of non-obvious, being non-obvious?
I believe if I were to distill it, it would probably be how to see what others miss. That's the subtitle we chose for the book. But it was very intentional in the sense that a big part of non-obvious thinking is learning to pay attention to these things that other people just walk past, whether it's an opportunity or a connection to someone. And the busier we get in our lives and the more digitized everything gets and the more our attention is, according to several people, being stolen from us by the addictiveness of the technology, the more important it becomes to train yourself to be a noticer, someone who sees these details. And I think the methodology behind non-obvious thinking can help you do that. But the benefits of doing that to your life are huge. I mean, it could be as life-changing as like meeting the person that you fall in love with as opposed to walking past because you're too distracted. Or it could be on the professional sense, meeting that person or making that connection to whoever the next role is or having the idea that launches your new startup. All of these things come from us paying attention so that we can ideate and not dismissing our brain and saying, well, we don't need you anymore because we're just doom scrolling.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. I think, especially of those of us in any sort of branding role or communications role, it's what is the doom scroll? What is the social space done to our attention span, our viewpoint of views of the world, our tribal bubbles? This is important because it's trying to, I think from your book, what I got from it too, is getting you outside your normal mores, biases, and to think differently. Truly, it's the Think Differently book, right?
Yeah. I'd say so. That's what we tried for.
What's a good example in the book, you think, as people obviously want to encourage people to buy it? And I read it. It's a great book. What do you think it's an example in it that would help solve a problem or drive innovation?
I think as the book is filled with tips,
Yes,
right?
it is.
It's very tip oriented. It's meant to be a super quick read. It's probably my shortest book I've ever written.
It's an easy read, though. That's the important thing I want to emphasize to people. It's a great airplane. It's the most important thing. It's the beach read. As a fellow author, it's if you can get it so people can consume it in a couple of days away and take along with frosty, sugary drinks, alcoholic drinks, and they can get something. That's what I love about it. It's very accessible in that way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we did work really hard to make it that way. So you could literally jump in and read a 3-page chapter and get something useful out of it, and then put the book down. And then when you came back to it a week later or a month later or however long later, you wouldn't feel like, oh, I lost the flow. It's not that style of book. It's a very jump in, jump out if you need to. Or you could just have a flight and read the whole thing and make a couple notes. But to answer your question, what is an actionable thing from the book? One lesson that I was just thinking about recently for a call I was on earlier today, actually, was the permission that we should give ourselves to come up with option C. Because a lot of times we're presented with situations where it's like either this or that, option A or option B.
Everybody.
And we feel like, oh, we got to pick. We got to choose option A or option B. And then you end up with option C being that brilliant outpouring of creativity. And the example we use in the book is, option A is someone comes to stay with you and you have a guest room and you give them a bed. Option B is they sleep on the couch. Option C is the futon, which was invented by a woodworker named William Brewer, who spent time in Japan, where he saw that people were rolling up mattresses and then unrolling them and putting them on the floor when guests would come over to stay. And he thought to himself, there's got to be a better way. And he invented the futon. So that's option C thinking. Now, you're probably not a woodworker and maybe you don't come up with the invention, but the mindset to do is the important thing.
I remember in your talk at South by about 2 years ago, you brought up I know you get a lot of talk, so if you don't remember it, but I do very vividly because I was in the audience. It's a personal relationship because you actually had it was unrelatable to you, but it was like you described like what if you had, I have the banana cutter. My son loves the banana cutter. You probably gave it up. You had an example of, this is the option A, B, C, right? It's like when food goes bad or there's something, because we have dates, we have other ways to do it, right? But at the same time, just lost you over there. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to read. I don't know what happened here. The Elgato, the technology died on me for a second. Let me go back. You were talking about an example of like when the food goes bad or it smells, and you were like, why wouldn't you just smell it? But I suffer from osmosia, so I can't really smell. Wow. So there are people out there. So I think, and my wife was like, can you smell the milk? Is it okay? Or can you smell this food? Is it okay to eat? Because I wouldn't know. I could eat something that could kill me. So when I'm like, if I'm old and by myself, I want that device. So it's like the option C that nobody thinks, well, why don't you just smell it? Or why don't you just look at the date? But then there's the option C is there's people that can't do either. Well, maybe they'll look at the date, but dates are a little like when you have to learn these sell by, best by, eat by, do by. That's a great.
Or you look at the day, but you don't look at the year. And you're like, oh, October 20th, it's good. But then you're like, oh crap, that was October 20th, 2014.
Oh, these are pandemic pickles. Like I can't.
You think, wait, pickles last forever though. You should be good, right?
Sure, it's canned. Okay, this is pandemic cereal. Yeah. Now I just remember that. I wanted to come and tell you
that's
that.
Interesting.
Yeah, because you probably don't think like who it is, but
I wouldn't have thought of that.
But then COVID came in, a lot of people lost their sense of smell or taste. Like they lost different senses, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think especially for old people, there's a device that'll also dispense your medicine. Because if you have forgetfulness, you could take your medicine twice. It could be very bad. So, but get you late. So I think as a futurist here, and we interview a lot of futurists, one thing I love when you and I have talked, like you consider yourself a reluctant futurist. Because I don't want everyone to put labels on themselves, but I love that because I consider myself for a long time, I was a stealth futurist because I've been practicing as a futurist for 20 years, but I brought it into my work and innovation and product. It was not like this overt, let's do futures projects because a lot of times, but the methods and the tools, but how would you define that? How would you define a reluctant futurist? I want to hear this term. I've been waiting for this one.
So, yeah. So that was one of the reasons why my co-author for my last book, The Future Normal, Henry Coutinho Mason, and I came together because we both had independently been describing ourselves this way. And we're like, wait, you use that too? And then we aligned and then we're like, oh, we should probably write a book together now. But the reason we call it reluctant futurist is because when you say I'm a futurist, it comes with some baggage.
Yes.
And the
It used to be, you couldn't call yourself that. You had to be bestowed that. It was like calling yourself sexy.
Yeah, there is that. There is that. I mean,
now there's a lot of people who are not
people
really.
believe it,
Yeah.
hide it, right? But there is that. But I think also when you put that lens on it, people think you're going to be looking into the far future and that you're not necessarily going to offer them anything practical for right now.
Yes, because
You're
a
going to
lot
do futurism theater, right? And be like, oh, in 2050, this is what's going to happen. And Poland is going to take over Europe. And you're like, okay, based on what? Based on guessing? Based on like George Freeman? Like what's going on? But for us, the reluctance was like, we didn't want to project too far into the future. We wanted it to be more authentic and it wanted it to be based on now. What the kind of related term we landed on was nowists. And nowist is we're looking at the future that's already happening right now. And what we're trying to do with our work is showcase it because if it's going to have as much of an impact on our collective future as it could, it needs funding, it needs media, it needs celebration, it needs awareness that it's even happening, right? So if you just see stories about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, then you'd be like, oh shit, we're screwed. There's going to be all this garbage and plastic in the ocean and everything's going to be microplastic and we got nothing. But if you see efforts that are cleaning it, that are working, stories of people who have these amazing innovations, you have the microplastic eating bacteria that eats it up, basically. These are the sorts of stories that are things that exist that are being researched right now. And I think the challenge is that we have to showcase and celebrate them much more and not allow the stories of doom to take over the entire narrative. It's not that there aren't bad things happening in the world. We're not oblivious to that. But when you have a media environment that celebrates and showcases the bad all the time, you lose focus of the things that are happening that are positive, and so they don't get the attention.
That's interesting because I was thinking about how. Listen, we're glad I can edit this later. So as a futurist myself, I have to do a lot of literacy training. There's a lot for parts of the futures research, future foresight profession. I would say there are those who are. It's a little more, there's ivory tower research, but there's a little more elitism are you trained in this? There's a lot of terminology that is unique to the space, right? Scenarios or backcasting. But I feel sometimes it's 95 and I'm trying to teach people not only what you can do on the internet, but how to get, I have to show them how to dial up. And what a personal, my mission is the next 10 years is to teach 1 million futurists, to get the create futures literacy. Over the next 10 years. When you talk about, we do things like backcasting, we talk about horizons, right? There are different horizons and different rates of change for different industries. And it's also obvious. Yeah. And to your point, people just look at, I don't care about 2050. I need to keep my job and I'm retiring in 10 years. Like I need to get my bonus. And that framing is hard for a lot of people. Backcasting helps, but I like the nowist view. I love that. I would like to co-opt that term sometime, because when I was at McKinsey, we created the futures practice. And it was a lot of challenge because McKinsey gets paid a lot of money to tell people what to do tomorrow and the next day, right? So the nowist view is important. Now, we had good timing because COVID changed the fragility mindset, the resilience. It was they needed insights, right? But over time, it's still, you have to be able to couch something in that frame. You have to frame it so that people can consume it and use it, right? You've been doing this for years. And we talk about change. How have businesses responded to trends and how have trends changed over the last decade or 15 years since you've been doing it?
You talk about futurist lingo. One of the futurist lingo elements is signals. And signals are often confused for trends. Signals are this idea that there's a story of something happening somewhere. Someone's doing something, some startup launch, some new app got created. There's a big behavior that people are latching onto and starting to do more and more.
Yeah.
And these are the signals that may indicate a broader trend. And I think that what was true in the past with futurist work specifically is that if you wanted to get a great breadth of these signals, you had to create some sort of a network of people who would be spotters. difference.
Yeah.
And basically,
TrendSpotter is more sexy than signals researcher.
Yeah, it's catchy.
Yeah, it's catchy. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's different now is that, first of all, you can get access to those databases where they used to be closed. Second of all, you can start to do some of the signals research on your own because of social media and because of the things people are sharing and posting and because of how media is responding to what's happening on social media and then writing for that. So now you have all of these sources of media and insight, and the challenge becomes to treat those as their own form of signal, right? So once something is popular enough that it gets written about in the New York Times, for example, that means it's jumped to a certain level where it's received mainstream media attention, which by something like that, versus something that's just individuals and are part of a subculture who should do. It can be really difficult to pay attention to enough of these signals to do meaningful trend and futures work because none of us has an unbiased look at what the world is. We all have our lenses of how we see things and we come at it from how we come at it. And so the challenge, I think, is to diversify as much of the sources of media that we have to things that we would not ordinarily be interested in so that we can start to see these signals in places where we would never have otherwise seen them. Like these signals, if you're doing this right, are things that are happening in communities where you don't necessarily know anyone. You have friends in that community who you would hear this from. These would be things that you hear externally, and now you're trying to assign meaning to them.
It's funny, we could talk for hours about this stuff. So talking about that mix of creativity and research, have you changed your process in doing this type of work over the years? Is there a method that helps you stay ahead of the curve? Methods that you do?
Yeah, I think probably I don't know if there's a good way to say this without it sounding
okay.
But I would say that the biggest thing that's changed over the years is that before I would read about or hear about something, and now I actually get to see it. Like I'm in the room. I get access to the meeting, or I get invited to the innovation lab or like the place. So I get to meet those people, or they're a fellow speaker at an event and I can interview them. Like the direct access I have now based on where I am in my career is something different than what I had 10 years ago. And I think that's really interesting too, because when you get to be in the room with these people projecting forward or being at one of these kind of think tank salon type events where literally the whole reason for being there is to project forward what you think the future is going to be and then talk about that. That's a different experience than reading a great article from the MIT Review about it.
It's very true. But I've been reflecting on my own, like how I look at trends and do signals work as a futurist and the impact of artificial intelligence, because there's a human element to doing all of this, but you said the thinking obvious part. It's a lot of empathy, it's a lot of creativity, but then again, I find certain areas like ideation or scenarios, like if you have the right data sources, because that's always what I preface with people. You're only as good as your data, because you can have bias. It's only how is it taught? What is it taught? Is a AI going to give you all social justice answers when it really needs to be balanced? It's like, how do you do that? And I think as it becomes more prevalent in this kind of trend work, how do you see this space changing? Like for you, like it seems like you've set a philosophy in place, like as you look outward to these next, say 5 years, because I can't even go beyond that. The rate of change in this thing is so fast. But because let me preface before you answer, LLMs are trained with a certain date. They're not like live from New York at Saturday night. In the moment, like you can look and have it analyze signals, and you could do it with other ways to gather and create RAGs, but you can't just go out to ChatGPT and ask and do this kind of work. But how do you see it changing, evolving?
I think some of the methods behind this, it's not necessarily that the methods will change. It's that the thing that is happening, the technology, the new insight, that's always changing. And so I think the challenge is to continue to listen in as effective ways as we have before and not get distracted by more noise being out there. I think that's the challenge.
Great. One of the things I talk a lot about, especially with this type of work, is ethics. What do you see the role with this method and this kind of mindset? What do you think ethics plays in this?
I think it's always going to be important in the work that we do as futurists to present the negatives along with the positives to elevate the people who maybe are doing the work more ethically as opposed to the ones who are making the most money, which is rarely the ones who are doing it the most ethically.
Yeah.
And finding that balance between the things that we talk about as a potential future. I do think that one of the challenges, and this is very central to the work as a futurist, but also to science fiction, because what futurists are doing and what science fiction writers are doing are imagining a future. And when you imagine that future lacking ethics, or where the winners are the ones who have the least ethics, and therefore we end up in a dystopia then that's the future that the next generation of technologists and of geniuses are seeing and making into reality. And when you have of that negative future that become the de facto way that we see the future, then that's what we end up building. Like what the line I use in my keynote is the only future we can make is the one we can imagine. And so it's our responsibility as people writing about the future, whether it's fictional or research-based, it's our responsibility to build the ethical considerations into the way that we write about it. Because otherwise, that part will just get forgotten. And it's even more important when you have all these LLMs being trained on the things we write. Because you want it to be trained on thinking about the ethical considerations too, right?
I'm a design futurist, and I do a lot of design fiction work. That can be prototyping, but it can also be a lot of narratives work, creating the worlds, doing the scenarios. But I call people the future, writing their stories, the kind of the real texture of the day-to-day and the moments of the things that they living in the future, right? And but I can do so far my experiences, things I might ask, there's things I don't consider. It's about the reach to other people that you might want to get other experiences or talk to people and that to get a better perspective because it's only limited, right? Am I going to write about things that influence me? Of course I will. But I also want to have just this tapestry of diverse voices, and putting that into a system is hard. And it requires, I think, constant vigilance in that way. I think about your work, which has been amazing to watch the last 15 years, that you work your butts off. You're, I think, the busiest, hardest working man in the training world.
I might take that testimonial and put it on my website.
You are the hardest worker. I mean, you're, yeah, I want to be where you want to grow up. I think it's funny when you look at these years, because you have this perspective that, like you said, some people haven't had careers as long as you and I have known each other, and you and I have been doing this. What's one of the things in the non-obvious, and especially in this kind of, we'll call it the yearbooks? What's one you thought would take off, but it did not? What was one you were like, this is going to be huge, and it was like, pew?
Oh man, there's quite a few. If you think about the numbers, I did 15 trends a year. Right, every year for 9 years. And then the 10th year was 10 mega trends that were basically elevating a bunch of different trends from the previous years into the 10 mega trend, right?
Yep.
So I've got more than 100 predicted trends. And I would say that some of the ones that were not, there was a theme, actually. It's hard to single out like, oh, this one was like the biggest failure ever. Because when I was writing these trends, they were reflecting what was already happening. Based on the way I wrote about them, none of them were wrong in the moment that I wrote them.
Yeah.
The thing that was wrong about them was my prediction that they would accelerate to continue to be a trend. That's the piece that didn't work out, right? And if I look at what was common amongst the ones that didn't turn out, it was that I was looking on too small a scale for where they were happening. For example, I wrote about pointillist filmmaking, which was this idea that we would have, like it was back when, you even forget what the platform was called, but it was like you could do those 7-second videos. Do you remember that social media platform where you did the 7-second videos?
Yeah, vaguely.
Any longer than that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was around for a while and it was like super big and then it went away. But like in that moment, there was like a huge watch brand that did the 4-second film festival. And so like people submitted films, quote unquote, that were 4 seconds long.
Yeah.
And then there was like one or two other examples of that. And I was like, oh man. And they were launching that network where it was like those episodes of vertical video and it was like episodes of shows. And each episode was like 4 minutes long and you could watch it like during a bus stop. And it was vertical. And there was a whole network that was created around these. Like, again, anybody could look up the names of these things. Like they were all things at a certain point.
They were that was the birth of the shorts. That was the precursor to shorts we see right now.
And now we have YouTube shorts and all that stuff. So it's not like it's going away. But the way that I thought it would evolve in terms of like dramatically affecting filmmaking and marketing and all of these things, like it just peaked and then it went back down. And I think the reason why it wasn't a great prediction is because it was too responsive to what was happening in the moment without being reflective enough of how that would go. Because if I had thought about it longer, I would have realized that watching a 4-second film is not a fulfilling human experience.
That's true.
In general. It's just not long enough. And so plus doing a 4-second film requires a level of creative genius that most people don't have. To tell a compelling story that would be something you could even call a film in 4 seconds, you need some pretty epic talent to pull that off. Most people don't have that.
I agree.
So your quantity of content that would be to live in that format would be limited. Now, all of these things seem perfectly logical now that I'm looking back on it.
Right.
But in that moment, I didn't see that stuff. I just saw, all these videos are getting shorter. This is going to be the trend, and I reacted to it. So that's the way that, not just me, that's the way that I think people who write about the future and trends can sometimes get it wrong.
It's interesting that you talk about it in that frame, because I think about you had it, but there was also an extension as it's your reluctant futurist thing. You saw the benefit, but you were like, it wasn't your world to live in. You saw its potential. But if you probably lived in it, you're probably, you know what, like you had just said, like it needs longer. What if it was 30 seconds? Like the short, people probably saw that and were like, you know what, this is too short. Like everything you said, even TikTok, how do I do this differently? Or how do I learn from this? I'll cite a current example is AI filmmaking. I've been diving deep into this, doing a lot on this Luma platform, Rev. There's so many different, like Runway. I'm fascinated. People do like these recreations of sci-fi films in 50 Panavision, 70 millimeter. Like they're amazing. I did a talk and I did a mock-up of a Nike shoe for 2035 called Glow. And it was women and I did everything AI generated. A lot of art. There was a lot of issues with it. Do I think over time? I think it will add to it, but I think there's something missing in it now that everyone thinks it's going to be like can get rid of filmmaking forever. I don't think it will. I think it'll help other indie filmmakers do certain shots or certain things, but again, it's only the limitations. I don't think it'll have the impact right now. Mark my words, we could be talking 5 years and be like, I was completely wrong. But I think, like your point, it's like you have to have a lot of creative energy and a lot of genius to make this thing work. The technology is going to improve, but what will it produce? So don't know. But looking at it now for you, what is things you're seeing in the non-obvious realm, things you talk about in your talks that you think now, what do you think will change? What's something that's blowing your mind, like over the next 10 years? Let's take AI out of the Gen AI as the given one, but what are the things you're seeing like over the next decade? I have one, but I want to see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the learned ability to completely augment what a creative professional can do with technology.
Yes.
We haven't even seen the potential of that yet.
I agree.
And if you go back to that famous cliche from Steve Jobs about the computer being a bicycle for your mind and apply it to what AI is going to be for creative professionals who have talent already, that is huge. And I think that there's way too much attention we spend on people who don't necessarily have talent, who are looking for AI to be the one-button solution to stuff they don't know how to do. Oh, one button, they can build my website. Oh, one button, it'll create the poster for me. Oh, one button, it'll make a film for me. No, that's what we're seeing and hearing about, or not seeing and hearing about so much. Is what is the Hollywood studio who creates Pixar-level shows and films going to be able to do now that they have this technology to make a film that used to take 5 years of post-production in 3 months?
Right. I agree, because Sora isn't out to the public yet, but it's definitely being on the enterprise for a lot of film companies. They're showing its power. Yeah. And if you have the server farm, if you have the server and the render farm, this is what I think is going on right now, is that they're training their systems with their images, their characters. It's not maybe the first one they create, but let's say they create like Toy Story. They could create whole new Toy Story stories because they have all the models, all the systems, everything's in there. All they need to do is prompt it and create the world because they've now built that environment.
And it takes away the necessity to do the tedious thing, the full creative thing.
That's right.
And the equivalent of it is there's equivalents in worlds well outside of Hollywood, right? Think about when we first started using spreadsheets and the ability to like take numbers and fill that whole spreadsheet for 1,000 lines. Someone used to have to type that or handwrite that. Now you just press the thing and it fills the whole thing. And then you could spend your time analyzing the numbers, figuring out the patterns, doing the sort of insight work on it because you don't have to do that entry. It's the same thing with these creative tools. If you can get past that basic, like you said, the world building, the basic aspect of it, you can really focus on the creative.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think over these years doing film 15, 16 years ago and cobbling together resources and the journey to that, what we could do now is, and it's only going to get better. Yeah. I think it's going to completely change. The other thing, the one that I was going to talk about was air taxi. I had a company 20 years ago for a different kind of aircraft, and it was an air taxi company. And now we have the right aircraft to do it. I think the mode in which we travel is going to change dramatically over the next 10 years. And it's going to come fast and quick. It's going to be in big cities, but I think it's going to change the way we think about how we travel unless everyone forces everyone to return to the office. But I think it's going to change how we think about where we live and the places we want to go instead of just in the car. But I'd like to look at some of the things that have influenced you and inspiration. When you do all this research, you read a lot of books, you've read a lot of things in your life. What's one book that profoundly influenced your thinking about the future, the kind of work you do? That's really had a great impact on you.
Oh, McGonagall's work is amazing. I just find her to be first of all, she's female, which is different in the world of futurism because there's so many men.
She's likable as a futurist. She's approachable.
Yeah, likable.
Yeah, she's a good communicator.
Very insightful. I mean,
she's a good communicator of this kind of work. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and the work is I find it to be very filled with insight.
Yes.
As opposed to filled with ego.
Yes.
Sometimes what it can be.
It's true.
But I read pretty diversely. As you know, I host a book awards program, so I get 1,000 books sent to me every year. So I'm always reading. I'm always consuming content, not always future content. I'm always reading.
How do you read that? Do you speed read? What are the methods you use?
No, I don't read all these books. Of course not.
I know.
There are signals we look at. Is this an original idea? Is it well done? Is it described? Is the author really excellent? Then there's a panel of people who read these books as well for me. And so there's no way I could. But usually every year we'll pick 15 winners who are on the short list.
Mm-hmm.
And those 15 books I definitely read.
That's great. And when we earlier spoke about when you were at Ogilvy, you transitioned into stepping off in this, which not everyone can do. It's like you had a lot of choices in those roads. So what do you wish you knew when you started the career, your journey? What's the one thing you've learned that you wish you knew?
Do you want? There's big picture stuff, maybe?
Yeah. Just something that's telling your
probably
younger self.
The most tactical one is I should have less focused on social media and blogs and more focused on my email list from the beginning.
Yeah,
that's definitely. I started my email list maybe 12 years after I'd been blogging and building an audience and like building people on all of these other social media platforms.
Yeah.
I built, 30, 40,000 people on Twitter, which was a total waste of effort.
Yeah.
Not that I had that much effort. I was just around early, I think, but that's just a waste. I don't use Twitter anymore. Nobody does.
Yeah.
Some people do, but I can't even call it X now. Like, it's just useless. So there are things like that where you spend all this effort and you have a huge audience, or not huge, but a decent sized audience. And then it becomes useless. And that's sad. That doesn't happen to email. I have an email list of subscribers now, and I write an email and publish it every Thursday. My open rate's usually 50%, and people are like really engaged. They great comments back. People share comments. They ask me questions. When I pose a question, they're like, oh, let me tell you about this. And I learn something from this amazing pool of people every time I send one.
That's great advice. I think a lot of young people would dismiss email, and I agree with you.
Not just young people. I dismissed it for a long time. I didn't realize the value of it. And now I'm going back to it. And people who are big into digital marketing, they'll all tell you the same thing.
I am as well.
Your email list.
I am as well. Because there's concepts, things I want to communicate. And you could use it as a announcement platform, but you ultimately will point them to the email. Like the email will be the core of it in a way to get to people.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, I wish I knew that. And then the other thing I do wish that I did more often earlier in my career, which I do now a lot, is bring people together and be the convener of that. Yes. Because I know a lot of people now, and I'm lucky enough to travel to a lot of cities. So I'm going to Houston this week, and we're just bringing together people who I'm connected with. I brought another friend of mine who lives in the area, and she's inviting people, and a lot of them don't know one another. And I haven't seen some of them in a long time. I just did an event a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, and one of the guys who came was someone I used to work with at Leo Burnett in Australia when I lived there 20 years ago. And I hadn't seen him for 20 years, but he was living in Chicago now, and I reconnected with him. And it was just because I stayed connected and I asked. So I think in our lives, we need someone to ask us hey, I'm going to be here. If you can come, it would be great. No pressure, right? I'll already be here at this time, at this place. If you could show up, great. And I am at the point, I think, in my life where I can be that person. And so I want to, because not only do I get to reconnect with them, but I get to introduce them to other amazing people who maybe they'll work with. Maybe that'll lead to their next job. Maybe that'll be an investor for somebody. It's just a thing that is important for us to have people in the world doing. And if you get to do what I do and travel around, then you should do that. I wish I did that earlier. Like I do that now with intention, but it's a relatively recent thing for me. And I wish that I had done it earlier.
It's a wonderful quality. And I look at the networking pyramid, I like to call it. There's the passive, the active, and then the top of the tiny 1% is the connector. People that they put people together versus just actively trying to meet with people. See, that's the real value in it. And I don't think a lot of people realize it. It takes time, but it's very rewarding. I wanted to give people who haven't read the book an opportunity, if they want to start applying this kind of thinking to their life, like where's the best place to start? This book and another one of your series? How would you roadmap the reader to help them in learning the mindset, things like that?
So this is where you do get into a little bit of the chicken and the egg situation, right? So this is like asking, which Star Wars movies should you watch first? Should you watch the ones that were done in the 70s and 80s because they were done first? Or should you watch the ones that chronologically come first because like in the storyline, then you watch the chronological way. Right. So some people are like, okay, traditionally, so if you want to experience non-obvious, the brand as it evolved, you'll read the trend work first and then you'll read non-obvious thinking. Mm-hmm. But if you were to ask me, I say non-obvious thinking is a prequel. It's the mindset, it's the thinking that
it would make sense.
Resulted in all of the trend work.
Right. All the things you're reading now.
I ended up writing it last meaning it just came out a couple weeks ago. So it's like the most recent one, right?
Yeah.
But you could easily read it first if you're unfamiliar with any of my other work, and it would maybe make a little more sense to do it that way. So if you are that sort of purist with the books where you're like, I got to read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first. I can't start with Magician's Nephew or, any of those, then okay. But if you're like, okay with reading it, the story, the way that it unfolds, then I would go start with non-obvious thinking. That's probably
You're obviously busy promoting the book. So is there anything for you in 2025? Kind of what's next for you with this continuing the journey? Any new projects, things you're excited about?
Yeah, I can't share too much about it, but non-obvious thinking is my 10th book. And so my next book is not going to be a business book. In fact, It's not even going to be nonfiction.
Cool.
Be fiction of some sort.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I need a new creative challenge, and non-obvious thinking, this book will be perfect fodder for all my speaking and everything for the next couple of years. So I won't really need another book in that sense. And I've been on this treadmill. I've written a new book every year for the last 10 years. So that's a lot.
It's a lot. I share it's a lot, but worthy. If people are looking to be an author, it's absolutely worth it. And you have a publishing company as well.
I do. Yeah. And I built that because I wanted to control the whole ecosystem. And so we built Idea Press, which is the publishing company. And now we've done nearly 100 books with other authors. So it's been very successful.
It'd be good to have you back and do an episode on the future of publishing and the future Gen AI's impact on writing. Yeah, I think we should definitely do that for people. Like,
you should make that a panel. You should get like one or two others. And
that's what I was thinking. Exactly. And because I look at the impact of, somebody gave me really good advice, like control the audible, right? Like your audio rights, control certain things, or especially one piece of advice is a couple of years ago was writing a book with a publisher and then doing some self-publishing in between. There's different models, but it's interesting to talk in 2025. What does it mean to publish? And
and I don't even think it's one answer. I think that it depends on what you would do and how you want to do it.
I just think a lot of people there's a lot of don't know you don't know. And I think it'd be fun to just change that for, I didn't know I could do that, right? Looking back, you've had 10 years of books, a great career. When you're looking back on things, this is that reflective time. Like, how do you want the work to be remembered? What kind of impact do you want this to have for people?
I would love to have this work remembered as being a force for helping people be more open-minded, for helping them be more accepting and understanding of people who don't have the same perspective that they do.
In fact, yeah.
To understand diversity and to celebrate that diversity. And for each of us to be willing to change our minds, to overcome any sort of cognitive biases, which we all have, and to just become better people and therefore create better communities that we live in. That's probably too elevated to think from a business book, but I do feel like when I get a chance to influence how people think, I have a chance to make this mission turn into reality. And that's really exciting.
That's wonderful. So life well lived. So how do people find you? Obviously, we talked about newsletters. We have a website. So let's talk about the book. Obviously, buy it. Do a review, as you say.
It's all pretty easy on nonobvious.com.
Yeah.
We paid good money to get that URL, so we definitely leverage it. Nonobvious.com/subscribe is where you can get to the newsletter. And if you're not sure and you want to see past editions, just go to nonobvious.com/newsletter and you could read the past editions. And if you like it, then you could subscribe. And then nonobvious.com/thinking, a new book. And then if you want to consider me as a keynote speaker, which I do a lot, then I have a personal site with videos and all that stuff. And that's just my full name. So
that's great. Rohit, thanks for being on. We'll have you on again soon. And great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.